Special thanks to these companies for being long-term partners of this channel.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Zach. Here we talk about overlanding, DIY, builds, gear, and we do some walkarounds. We do a ton of awesome stuff related to overlanding. And today we're gonna be talking about some of the modifications that I've done to my rig that I really think I could have done first to kind of gain the most value. So a lot of you out there are probably looking at purchasing a vehicle to build out for overlanding. Maybe some of you already have really built out vehicles, or maybe some of you are just here to kind of see if I bring any sort of new ideas to the table. But what I want to talk about today is these sorts of mods where if you are starting out now, or you're trying to do a bunch of mods over the winter, which the winter is a great time to modify your vehicle, then we can talk about some of the things I would prioritize if I were starting completely from scratch. So if you like content like this, or you like what I'm doing with the channel, please consider giving the video a like. It really helps me out, helps me continue to grow the channel. And the more growth I see, the more I'm able to make more content like this without being an incredible burden. And also, if you like more content like this, consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell down below, because that's gonna be probably the best way for you to see when I post new content, other than, following me on Instagram or something where I post there pretty regularly too. So with that being said, let's jump into the first thing that I would recommend. And the first thing is going to be tires. So if you're not necessarily thinking about lifting your vehicle, but you at least are thinking about maybe taking it off-road, I highly recommend you change out your tires. A lot of, 4Runners and other vehicles, they just come stock with street tires. And there's nothing wrong with street tires. They probably get the best gas mileage, and depending upon the street tire you have, it does well in the snow. But if you're trying to go off-road, you're probably gonna need something a little bit different. So a good go-to would be some BFG KO2s, BFG being BF Goodrich, or Falcon Wild Peak AT3Ws. Those are some really good ones I've seen. I actually just put some AT Trails on my wife's Subaru Outback. So if you're one of the soft roaders out there, check out those tires, because they have like a super long tread warranty, and apparently they do amazing in the snow. So far they've been great, but they're brand new. So what can you expect? You'd really hope so. Honestly, maybe that might scare you a little bit, just immediately swapping out tires. Once you've just bought a vehicle, tires are not a cheap expense. But what I would recommend is, especially with 4Runners and a lot of overlanding vehicles in general, a lot of people upgrade to 33-inch tires. Now, one thing that's really nice is a lot of Jeep Wrangler guys will get Jeep Wranglers with 33-inch tires stock, and they immediately want to put 35s or 37s on their Jeep Wrangler. So if you go and look on Craigslist or Facebook, a 285/70 R17, which is about like a 32.8-inch tire, there's lots and lots of tires that are probably in great condition, and people are just getting rid of them, not because they're bad or they're trying to scam you or anything like that. It's just they're trying to upgrade the size of their tire. They're trying to offset the cost of that bigger tire a little bit by getting rid of their old tires. So go check that out. It's definitely a good option for getting a new set of tires. So the tires are a modification I think should be almost one of the first things you do if you're trying to take this off-road, because a good set of tires is gonna get you such a long way no matter what kind of terrain you're trying to do. Now, with that being said, that's not gonna be necessarily everything that will get you anywhere, but be reasonable with thinking through how your tires are gonna impact the trails that you can do. Now, along the sort of category of just general driving experience things, would be also upgrading your fog lights and your LEDs. Now, you don't need to go hog wild with all kinds of crazy new lights, but what I will recommend is a lot of cars come stock with halogens that are Toyotas. Unfortunately, a lot of the other newer vehicles come stock with LEDs, but I don't know exactly what vehicle you're starting with, but I would recommend getting something with white light that's bright, because you're gonna really be appreciative of having that extra output. Whether you're off-road or on-road, having bright headlights is really nice. It's kind of like having built-in off-road lighting, because if you just had those basic halogen lights, they're not very bright, and so also off-road they wouldn't be very good either. So upgrading those lights, you're going to see a lot of benefit on-road and off-road. And to kind of supplement that, I would definitely recommend upgrading your fogs. Now, a lot of people will get aftermarket off-road fog lights, and this is probably what I would recommend to be, the first off-road lighting modification you do. because you can get a high output fog light that you really don't ever really need to use on the road, but it's going to be substantially helpful when you're off-road to just provide that supplemental lighting. And some people do a white fog, which if you prefer to have white light off-road, then that's probably the better option for you. But if you're like me and maybe some others who like to have yellow light because it doesn't reflect off of snow and fog quite as poorly, then you're probably going to want to look into getting like a yellow light of some kind. And I have Diode Dynamics in particular. I really love mine, and you can get them in 3 different levels of output. So if you're trying to do this on a budget, you can get the lowest output and it's still going to be a great light. And if you're really trying to maximize the output of your fog light, you could really go to the max and get the highest output model. So I really recommend upgrading those 2 things, because there's definitely a budget way to do it and there's a high-end way to do it, and there isn't necessarily a right or wrong. It's just going to kind of depend on your application. So those are some just generic vehicle upgrades I heavily recommend doing sort of first before some of the other things. But let's jump right into maybe some of the other camping things you can do, because depending upon what kind of trails you're wanting to do, and especially where you're wanting to camp, putting on some sort of suspension lift is really going to be nice. So I'll tell you a little story. When I first got my 4Runner, it was basically stock. It had the stock TRD Pro suspension, which isn't really anything of a lift. It's just a little bit nicer suspension. And I went out to Colorado and I did some trails, and they were really fun, and I could do most things with them in, beginner to moderate level trails. But there's certain spots where if you're hitting a hard obstacle or you have to take a hard line, not having very much suspension travel, or just not having a lift to clear some rocks or ledges could be really challenging. And so depending upon what you're trying to do, I definitely recommend getting some sort of lift. So spacers, I think, really get knocked. And honestly, I think they're going to be totally fine for some people. If you're wanting to just do some light off-roading, or you are just trying to get your feet wet and you want to see if you like having a lifted vehicle, trying out spacers and just making sure they're installed correctly, I think is going to work just fine. A lot of people get kind of scared of them. They do have some negatives, like they lower your whole entire shock body. So that means you're not going to have as much up travel, but that's kind of to be expected, that you're not going to probably have perfect performance compared to some sort of upgraded suspension. Now, on the flip side of having that spacer lift, you could just get a, entry-level suspension system, but those aren't necessarily much of a better ride quality. Everyone says that spacers have such a bad ride quality and they aren't very good. Well, some of the entry-level suspension systems like my Old Man Emu or the Bilstein 5100s, depending upon who you ask, they would say those are a very stiff, hard ride as well. So, who's to say with all of these subjective ratings on suspension, whether one is going to be so much better than the other? Just, make sure to do a little bit of research, but I would almost say that, if you're trying to get some sort of suspension lift, look into sort of those middle tier areas. Otherwise, a spacer lift might be just fine for whatever you're trying to do. That's something that I want to do, is I want to work up to one of those little bit nicer suspension systems, because after having my Old Man Emu kit, it rides very rough on the trails. It looks great and it performs amazing on gravel roads and on road, but anytime I'm hitting hard obstacles and stuff, it's a very stiff ride. So there isn't necessarily this golden answer of don't get a spacer lift, just get a entry-level suspension kit and you're gonna be totally happy. There's definitely trade-offs to everything and you get what you pay for. So, that would kind of be my approach for picking out a suspension kit, because you're probably going to want to do some sort of suspension lift if you're going to be taking your vehicle off-road past just some sort of forest road. So, and then along the lines of just doing a little bit more modification for camping and doing some off-road trails would be just getting some aftermarket crossbars. So you don't necessarily need to go out and get, a fancy roof rack, but a lot of stock roof racks, the crossbars, you can't mount hardly anything to them, and that's what can be really frustrating. So there's a lot of great companies that make aftermarket crossbars. The ones I got were from LFD Off-Road. They were super awesome. You could get them in like a steel or aluminum version, depending upon what your preference would be. And they were a fraction of the cost of buying a full roof rack. And I got a lot of, the benefits that you get from having a roof rack, and you could buy more crossbars still to put on your stock roof rack if you needed a lot of mounting locations, and you still would spend less than getting a full roof rack. So definitely look into that. It's a nice roof storage option. In addition to that, you're probably gonna need some sort of communications on the trail. I've really liked my Midland MXT275. It's just a cigarette lighter plug-in GMRS radio. You will need to probably look into the certification for GMRS, but it's super high power. It comes with a nice handheld set that you can type in the channel that you need, and it's super easy to just use while communicating out on the trail. And that's not even a super expensive radio. I mean, you could totally just go with like a little handheld FRS or walkie-talkie and you'd be totally fine. So just kind of depends on what your budget's gonna be, but some sort of basic communication is gonna be super handy in case cell service isn't very good and you're trying to talk with the other rigs out on the trail. The last thing kind of camping wise is just to build some sort of sleeping arrangement. You know, whether you're going to build a basic sleeping platform, whether you want a rooftop tent. I tend to think that people prefer either sleeping in their vehicle or on top of their vehicle. I know a lot of people out there are like, well, if you're just looking for a budget option, just use a ground tent. You don't need any of these other things. And you know, I kind of get that, but also when you're in the backwoods and you don't know what's out in the woods, I can see where either being high off the ground or inside your vehicle, there's just some peace of mind there and you may sleep better. And so, you know, you could go as cheap as building just a flat plywood surface in the back of your vehicle to sleep on and to throw your camping equipment on. Or you could, you know, build something out a little more fancy, kind of like what I have. Or, you know, if you really are set on having a rooftop tent, you could do that too. But just figuring out how your camping setup is going to be arranged, you know, don't necessarily ball out on just your camping setup. Make sure you're balancing all these other things so that you can go out and have fun on the trail and also be able to, you know, camp efficiently. So those are sort of some of my just, you know, trail and camping modifications I would recommend. They're kind of the good things to start with, and then you can totally work up from there from, you know, like armor and sliders and all those other things. But what I just mentioned is just kind of the important things that I use every single time I go out on the trails. And you can definitely do all those things in a budget manner. If you're, you know, worried about spending too much in a certain category, you totally can do something a little more affordable. So then the last category, which is probably not the most exciting, but definitely gonna be the most important in my opinion, is just having some good recovery gear. And this sort of recovery gear is basically gonna be broken down into traction boards, a tow strap, and then a battery jumper. So in the traction boards that I have, they're an off-brand version from Amazon. They had really good reviews and they were cheaper than Max Trax, so I jumped right on them and I've liked them. They work really well, and a lot of people really like having traction boards because almost all the time you can just get out with them rather than needing like a winch or a tow. And people use them all the time to level their vehicle when you're camping. So a lot of times your campsite's not gonna be level. Traction boards work great to level out the vehicle. But honestly, I've been really recommending these Go Treads lately. Go Treads are these folding traction boards that a lot of people rave about, and they fold up into like a little bag and they're really easy to store in your vehicle. And so these folding traction boards are really handy because if you're not trying to mount your traction boards on the outside of your vehicle, or you live in town and you don't necessarily want someone to be messing with gear on the outside of your vehicle, it's pretty sweet to be able to just fold these up and throw them in the back of your vehicle. And you also could just technically leave them in your garage if you're not out on the trail and you don't need them, you know, commuting back and forth from work or something. So I totally would recommend these folding traction boards. I've heard great things about them and they're super convenient. The other two things are just going to be kind of for if you're in a pinch or you have a problem and you need to be pulled out of somewhere. You know, you don't want to rely on someone else to have a tow strap. And if you're like me, I typically tend to like riding with other people out on the trails, so someone else is going to be able to either winch you out or tow you out. And so at least having a tow strap will be good, especially if you're trying to, you know, in a bad situation, get out of being stuck. So and then the last thing I'm going to recommend is just having like a set of jumper cables, or even better yet, a battery jump starter. So I have a Fox Speed jump starter. They sent me one and it's been great for me. I don't really ever need it, so it's just nice to have it. And these are the kind of things where you can go and buy the absolute name brand one, or you can buy one that's maybe more on the budget side. I would say the Fox Speed one is more on the budget side. It just kind of depends on your methodology and thinking on these sorts of things. You know, I know a lot of people who won't buy anything but a Warn winch because they don't want them to fail under any circumstance. You could maybe have the same exact thought process for a battery starter, that you don't want some off-brand one to fail on you in the middle of the woods. You know, I totally get that, but whatever your thought process is, I just recommend having one of these, because if you, for some reason, you know, left your low beams on, or an inside light of your vehicle was on throughout the night, or some sort of problem came up where you were camping out in the woods and you needed a jump, you know, it's just nice to have one of these things along. Not to mention, maybe you're just sitting at work at 6 p.m. and it's been like -5 all day, and for some reason your car won't start. Having one of these things in your vehicle will be super handy for just quick jumping the vehicle and getting home. So there's a lot of utility in overland modifications that you're probably noticing, where you will use a lot of this stuff on your day-to-day, and you'll also use it when you're out on the trail. Now, I realize everyone doesn't daily drive their trail rig, but in my case I do, and I know a lot of people do as well. So that's one way that you could probably justify some of the major utility you'll get out of all of these modifications. Those are just some of the modifications that I've done to the rig that I think are super important. And, you know, I didn't necessarily know some of these things when I first started building my rig. I didn't know if one thing was better than the other, and I bought certain recovery gear first that I probably never should have. For example, I bought a winch and a bumper very early on because I was super worried about doing trails by myself and getting stuck and having to winch myself out. And here I am, and I've maybe done like one trail once by myself. You know, every single other time I've gone with other people, to where someone else probably could have winched me out or just towed me out. So there's certain things that I've bought probably way too early that I didn't need to, and had I just waited on buying those things, I could have bought other modifications that probably would have been more important and more helpful earlier on. So I just figured I'd do this video, tried to kind of get it out at the beginning of the winter so that most of you, or at least some of you who really like to do some of these modifications in the winter, so that you've got your summers free to do trips and, you know, go camping, then hopefully some of this could maybe give you some insight, or just further validate, you know, maybe some thoughts you had on some upcoming modifications. So thank you so much for watching. Again, if you like content like this, or you like what I'm doing, please consider subscribing to the channel, because it helps me out, helps the channel grow, and like the video if it brought you any sort of value. So with that being said, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.